One of the fickle things about economic development is that the process isn't the same for everyone. Britain was first, France and the Low Countries mushed together in second place, Germany was third, America roughly fourth, followed by Japan. But because the technologies involved are constantly evolving, even among this first broad batch, the paths differed. Britain's process was slow because the Brits were literally making things up as they went along. Germany's development was far quicker, and not simply because the Brits were kind enough to blaze the path for others. Germany exists in a geopolitical pressure cooker, ringed by strategic and economic competitors. The habitable bits of German lands on the Rhine, Danube, Weser, Elbe, and Oder rivers are, at best, loosely connected. It's easy for Germany's more consolidated neighbors to split it apart. If Germany fails to press every economic development process to the limit, it is overwhelmed. So the German industrialization experience of the late 1800s and early 1900s was absolutely frenetic. Germany also had some significant geographic advantages over the Brits when it came to capital generation and supply chain management. The German river system, in particular the Rhine-Ruhr system of Western Germany, is the densest network of naturally navigable waterways in the world. It is perfect for industrialization. The Ruhr region has some of Europe's best coal deposits, and none of those pesky water table problems that so hindered the Brits. Add it up, and German industrialization was less a meander and more of a nervous, I think someone is following me jog. The Americans' process was far slower, nearly as slow as the Brits, but for wildly different reasons. While the German industrialization process didn't really get going until the 1830s, the really intense part was between 1880 and 1915. In the United States, the beginning of the process, the start of the railroad era, was similarly in 1830. But American cities were not fully industrialized until the 1930s, and the American countryside not until the 1960s. In many ways, the American experience was an inverse image of the German one. There was no geopolitical pressure, so no need to speed things along. And while the Germans had a very dense industrial, riverine, and population footprint, the Americans were all sprawled out. The useful lands of the United States are about 25 times the area of the useful lands of pre-World War I Germany. And the Americans didn't have anything resembling a state industrial policy until they were in World War II. For the Americans, everything has always been rather la-di-da. Japan was a latecomer to the first round, not really gaining traction until the Meiji Restoration of 1868 gutted the old feudal order. But like the Germans, the Japanese shot ahead quickly out of necessity. The home islands are poor in pretty much every imaginable raw material, so Japan had no choice but to forge an empire in order to secure the materials required for industrialization. Since that meant taking other people's stuff, the Japanese had no choice but to move very quickly. The Koreans were early victims of the Japanese expansion and remained colonized until the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings freed them. They then went on to be among the order's most enthusiastic participants, becoming the vanguard of industrialization's second major wave. Their industrialization path can be best defined as a panicky sprint. The Koreans, even today, are desperate to protect their sovereignty from all things Japanese. Singapore followed nearly a Korean path for similar reasons, with the part of the Japanese villain being played by Malaysia. Vietnam prioritized political unity over economic development, and so remained pre-industrialized and poor until the 1990s, unless you're in Ho Chi Minh City, aka Saigon, in which case you were industrialized a century ago, courtesy of French capital. Even in 2022, Vietnam feels less like two different countries and more like two different planets. Thailand, far more historically confident in its ability to repel invaders, the country's core is ringed by jungle mountains, lies somewhere between both in terms of pacing and outcome. Not everyone is at the same level, developmentally speaking, or even proceeding at the same pace. This can be awful, in that countries that are further along tend to have more oomph to their economic systems in terms of productivity, wealth, and diversification, and can use that oomph to lord over less advanced systems. Welcome to colonialism. But this differentiation can also be great, in that if the macro-strategic environment doesn't allow traditional colonialism, like, say, the American-led global order, there are hefty arguments to be made for manufacturing integration. Between the changed geostrategic environment of the order and the rise of containerized shipping, the security and cost concerns that had prevented meaningful cross-border integration since the dawn of time had finally unclenched. In any manufactured product that has more than one piece, there are opportunities for efficiencies. Take something really simple, a wooden top. There's the conical spinny thing and the rod-like spindle, typically glued together. While it is reasonable to expect the cone and the rod to be fashioned by the same woodworker, said woodworker probably didn't make the glue. 2 different skill sets, 2 different price points. Paint said top, and we're already up to 3. Apply that basic concept of specialization to a cell phone. Display screen, battery, transformer, wiring, sensors, camera, modem, data processor, system on a chip. That last is a fancy little gadget that includes a video processor, a display processor, a graphics processor, and the phone's central processing unit. Nobody would expect one worker to be able to make all of it. Nobody would expect the worker who plugs in the relatively low-tech wiring to be compensated at the same rate as the worker who fine-tunes the sensors. Imagine if all the pieces were made in Japan, a country with a per capita income of some $41,000. That system on a chip would be pretty fly, and it should be. The Japanese excel at complex microelectronic work. But it stretches the mind to think that there might be some Japanese dude who loves to run an injection mold system to make the phone case for $1 an hour. It would be like Lady Gaga teaching piano lessons to 4-year-olds. The combination of cheap, sacrosanct shipping and nearly endless workforce variety enabled manufacturers to split apart their supply chains into ever more complex, more discrete steps. If you were to trace the full supply chain of a car, here's the short version. Metals including platinum, chrome, and aluminum, wrapped in soldered wires, a full diagnostic and performance-enhancing computer system, rubber for the tires, synthetic fabrics made from petroleum, plastics for the interior, glass and mirrors, gears and pistons, ball bearings, and injection-molded buttons to turn the radio all the way up to 11. Each of these, and each of the 30,000 other parts that go into a standard passenger vehicle I did not list, has its own highly customized workforce and its own supply chain. Each part has to be assembled into an intermediate product, air conditioning, engine, lighting, by its own workforce, and then assembled into another intermediate product, dashboard, car frame, by its own workforce, and on until the whole mess of stuff finally reaches assembly. The supply chains of U.S. automaker Ford are among the most complex of any firm in existence, tapping more than 60 countries and 1,300 direct suppliers that together have more than 4,400 manufacturing sites. If final assembly happens in Chongqing, China, the vehicle will be shipped down the Yangtze for 8 to 11 days, dwell at Shanghai for a few days, then get sent on to Los Angeles with a sailing time of 20 days, before getting loaded onto a train en route to a regional distribution center, and finally one of those specialized trucks you see on the interstate that shuttles the final product from the rail yard to the dealership. Even once the car is finished, it still takes about 6 weeks to get to a point of sale. The insurance for the ship most likely came from London, and the regulations that make sure that the gas cap won't somehow murder you in your sleep came from the European Union. At each step, the need for inputs expands. At each step, the differentiation of the input stream expands. At each step, the demand for supporting infrastructure expands. At each step, the need for petroleum to fuel everything expands. All this occurred in bits and pieces between the Americans and their core Cold War allies throughout the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. But with the Cold War's end, the scope for the differentiation became truly global, and the pace accelerated to lightning speeds. Such increases in complexity and value now play out across every manufactured product. In the 20 years following 1996, a period that includes the Great Recession, global maritime trade doubled by volume and tripled by value. Trade that to that point had required 5 millennia to build. Everything didn't simply get bigger in the post-Cold War globalized world. Everything got faster as well.